Your sister owes $754,000. My mother slammed a thick manila folder right into my plate of food, splashing gravy onto my silk blouse. You are going to liquidate your stock portfolio to pay this off by tomorrow, or you are no longer a part of this family. I looked at my mother's furious face, then at my sister who was forcing out fake tears, and finally at my brother-in-law who could barely hide his smirk. I slowly wiped the gravy off the folder and stood up. Then I guess I am not family. I turned around and walked out. 48 hours later, I had 36 missed calls, and they were begging me for mercy. They did not know that the debt they tried to force on me was owed to a company I secretly owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who treated you like an ATM. My name is Zola. I am 32 years old and a partner at one of the most ruthless private equity firms in Atlanta. Growing up, I was never the favorite child. That title belonged to my younger sister, Dominique. Our parents, Yvonne and Calvin, built a highly successful real estate brokerage and were obsessed with presenting the perfect wealthy family image to our church and their country club friends. Dominique played the role of the perfect daughter beautifully. She was pampered, sheltered, and handed everything on a silver platter. I was the independent one, the one who worked 80-hour weeks to build my own fortune because I knew I could never rely on them. The tension started the moment I pulled my car into the winding driveway of my parents' sprawling brick estate in Buckhead last Sunday. Usually Sunday dinners at my parents' house were loud events. There would be jazz music playing from the patio speakers, the smell of roasted turkey and collard greens filling the air, and my mother bragging loudly on the phone to her friends. But this time the house was completely silent. I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors and immediately felt the heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Nobody came to greet me in the foyer. I walked into the formal living room and found my entire family gathered like they were waiting for a funeral to begin. My sister Dominique was curled up on the expensive white leather sofa, holding a tissue to her face and sobbing quietly. Her husband Trent was pacing back and forth in front of the massive stone fireplace. Trent was a 34-year-old white man who claimed to be a luxury car importer and cryptocurrency entrepreneur. In reality, he was a smooth-talking grifter who used big business buzzwords to impress my parents. They completely worshipped him. They loved the idea of having a white businessman in the family to show off to their elite circles, completely ignoring the fact that his supposed businesses never seemed to produce any actual profits. Trent ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, doing a terrible job of acting like a man under immense stress. He sighed heavily and looked at my parents with a look of manufactured defeat. My father Calvin sat in his leather armchair with a stern, rigid posture. My mother Yvonne was pacing nervously, her designer jewelry clinking with every step. When I walked into the room, all four sets of eyes snapped toward me. "You are late," my father said, his voice cold and devoid of any warmth. I looked at my watch. "I am exactly on time, Dad. What is going on here? Why is everyone acting like someone died?" My mother let out a dramatic gasp. "Have some compassion, Zola. Your sister is going through the worst crisis of her life right now, and you walk in here with that arrogant attitude. Just sit down at the dining table. We need to have a serious family meeting." I kept my face perfectly neutral, a skill I learned from years of negotiating hostile corporate takeovers. I walked into the dining room and took my usual seat. The table was set with my mother's finest china, and the food was already served, but nobody had touched a single bite. Dominique dragged her feet into the room and collapsed into the chair next to Trent, who immediately wrapped a comforting arm around her shoulders. He looked across the table at me with a pathetic, pleading expression that made my stomach turn. Before I could even pick up my fork, my mother marched over to me. She did not sit down. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder, and slammed it down directly onto my dinner plate. The impact rattled the crystal water glasses and sent a splash of brown gravy flying onto the sleeve of my blouse. I looked down at the folder. The label on the front was from a high-risk corporate lending firm. "Open it," my father commanded from the head of the table. I calmly used my napkin to wipe the gravy off the folder before flipping it open. The first page was a final notice of default. I scanned the numbers quickly. The total outstanding balance was $754,000. I closed the folder and pushed it to the side. I see Trent has been playing with money he does not have again, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. What does this have to do with me? Trent suddenly leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and burying his face in his hands. It is the supply chain issues, Zola. You know how the global market is right now. The luxury cars I imported got held up at customs, and the venture capital firm called in the loan early. It is a temporary cash flow problem, I swear. If I just have a little time, I can turn it around. Dominique let out a loud wail. We are going to lose everything, Zola. The business is ruined. You have to help us. My mother stepped closer to my chair, towering over me with a look of absolute authority. Trent is family, Zola. And in this family, we protect our own. We know you just closed that massive acquisition deal with your private equity firm. We know how much stock you hold. You are going to liquidate your shares first thing tomorrow morning and wire the money to Trent's account to clear this debt. I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the sheer audacity of her demand. You want me to sell nearly $1 million of my hard-earned stock to pay off a high-risk loan your son-in-law took out for his failing vanity project. It is not a vanity project, my father barked, slamming his fist on the table. Trent is a visionary. He just hit a rough patch. You have more money than you know what to do with, Zola. It is your duty to help your sister and her husband. God blessed you with that wealth so you could lift up your family in times of need. I leaned back in my chair and folded my arms. My wealth is not a blessing that fell from the sky, Dad. It is the result of me working late nights while Dominique was out spending your money on designer bags and European vacations. I am not a bank, and I am certainly not an ATM for Trent's reckless financial mistakes. The answer is no. I will not give you a single dime. The silence in the dining room was so heavy you could cut it with a knife. For a few seconds, the only sound was the ice melting in my father's crystal water glass. Then my mother, Yvonne, let out a sharp breath. She looked at me as if I was a stranger who had just wandered off the street and insulted her in her own home. I watched her perfectly manicured hands grip the edge of the polished wooden table until her knuckles turned completely white. You are incredibly selfish, Zola, she whispered, her voice dripping with absolute venom. You have always been this way, always thinking only about yourself, always so cold and calculated. I looked right back at her, keeping my posture perfectly straight. Refusing to pay off a massive debt for a grown man is not selfish, Mother. It is called having basic boundaries. My mother stepped closer to me, and the scent of her expensive floral perfume was almost choking in the tight space. She pointed a trembling finger at my sister Dominique, who was still sobbing dramatically into Trent's shoulder. Look at your sister Zola. Just look at her. Dominique is vulnerable right now. She has a gentle heart and she is sensitive. She is not hardened and ruthless like you are. You survived in the corporate world because you do not care about anyone but yourself. But Dominique needs protection right now. She needs her family. How can you sit there in your designer clothes bought with money you have more than enough of and watch your own flesh and blood suffer like this? I felt a familiar tight pain in my chest, but I refused to let it show on my face. This was the exact same script my mother had read from my entire life. When we were teenagers, and Dominique wrecked my first car, my mother told me I was selfish for being angry because Dominique was traumatized by the accident. When I paid my own way through college, working double shifts, while Dominique spent thousands of dollars on sorority dues, my parents called me greedy for not sharing my tip money with her. The narrative in this house was always exactly the same. Dominique was the fragile flower who needed constant tending, and I was the stubborn weed that could survive anything they threw at me. Trent decided it was his turn to speak up. He looked at me with a pathetic puppy dog expression that made my skin crawl. Zola, you do not understand how high-level business operates. Venture capital is incredibly risky. Sometimes you have to leverage debt to scale up your operations. I just need this bridge loan paid off so I can restructure my assets. We are family, Zola. I would do the exact same thing for you if you were in trouble. I slowly turned my head to look at him. Trent, you do not even have a real business. You have an Instagram account where you post motivational quotes and a leased sports car that you can barely afford to put gas in. Do not lecture me about venture capital. I structure multi-million-dollar corporate buyouts before breakfast. You borrowed money from a predatory lending firm because no legitimate bank would ever approve a commercial loan for someone with zero collateral and zero revenue. Trent turned pale and swallowed hard, completely losing his fake businessman persona. Dominique let out another loud wail, burying her face deeper into his expensive suit jacket. "You are so mean," she cried loudly. "You have always been jealous of me and Trent. You just want to see my marriage fail because you are single and miserable." I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity of her statement. "Yes, Dominique, I am incredibly jealous of your unemployed husband and your $750,000 debt. You really figured me out." "That is enough, my father," Calvin roared from the head of the table. His booming voice echoed off the high ceilings of the dining room, making the crystal chandelier vibrate slightly. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back and stood up, towering over all of us. The veins in his thick neck were bulging, and his face was dark with absolute rage. I had seen this exact look many times before. It was the look he used to intimidate contractors and bully real estate agents into doing exactly what he wanted. But I was not one of his terrified employees. "You listen to me very carefully, Zola," he said, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. "We raised you in this house. We gave you the prestigious family name that got you into those fancy corporate boardrooms. You owe us respect, and you owe this family your absolute loyalty. I will not tolerate this kind of blatant disrespect under my roof." I stood up slowly, making sure my movements were calm and deliberate. I smoothed out the front of my silk skirt. "Then I suggest you hand the folder to the person who actually took out the loan, Dad, because I am completely done listening to this nonsense." My father pointed a thick, heavy finger right at my face. "You are not walking away from this. Here is exactly what is going to happen. You have exactly 48 hours to liquidate whatever stocks you need to liquidate and wire that money directly to Trent's account. If you do not do this, if you walk out of this house and let your sister take this fall, you are no longer our daughter." The dining room went dead silent again. My mother gasped lightly, but she did not say a single word to contradict him. Dominique peeked out from Trent's shoulder, her eyes wide with anticipation. They all expected me to crumble right then and there. In our community, and in our family, being disowned was considered the ultimate punishment. It meant being totally cut off from everyone. The cousins, the aunts, the uncles, and the entire church community would turn their backs on me. My parents truly believed that the threat of being isolated and shamed would force me to open my checkbook and save their precious image. I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had spent my entire childhood praising my sister while completely ignoring my academic achievements. I looked at my mother, who only called me when she needed something expensive to show off to her country club friends. I looked at Dominique and Trent, two parasites who were perfectly willing to drain my entire life savings just to cover up their own catastrophic failures. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen a few times, setting a countdown timer for exactly 48 hours. I held the phone up so my father could see the bright digital numbers clearly on the screen. "I accept your terms," I said, my voice perfectly steady and ice cold. My father's face dropped in absolute shock. "What did you just say?" "I said I accept. I am no longer your daughter. Consider me a complete stranger from this moment forward. But let me give you a piece of free advice since you love business so much. When you owe a high-risk firm $754,000, the clock is ticking for you, not for me." I dropped the phone back into my purse and picked up my car keys from the table. The shock on their faces was absolute and incredibly satisfying. My mother stood frozen, with her mouth slightly open, unable to form a single word of her usual emotional manipulation. Trent looked genuinely terrified, as if he finally realized the massive safety net he was relying on had just been completely cut away. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room. My heels clicked loudly against the marble floors of the foyer, echoing through the silent house. I did not look back even for a second. I walked out the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped into the cool Atlanta evening air. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the massive estate. As I watched their perfect house disappear in my rearview mirror, I did not feel sad or abandoned. I felt completely free for the first time in my life. But the timer was running, and I knew my family well enough to know they would not give up that easily. The real war was just about to begin. By the time I pulled my car into the private parking garage of my downtown penthouse, my phone was already vibrating continuously against the leather passenger seat. The glowing screen illuminated the dark interior of my car, showing a steady stream of incoming notifications. Texts, calls, and voicemails were stacking up faster than I could swipe them away. My family was wasting absolutely no time deploying their favorite psychological weapon against me: the flying monkeys. In psychology, flying monkeys are the enablers that a toxic person uses to do their dirty work and to wear down their victims. My parents had an entire army of them ready to attack at a moment's notice. I ignored the buzzing and carried my purse into my quiet apartment. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, which was a stark, beautiful contrast to the suffocating traditional walls of my parents' estate. I poured myself a glass of iced sparkling water, set my phone on the large marble kitchen island, and finally looked at the screen. 36 missed calls, countless text messages calling me cold-hearted, greedy, and a terrible sister. I tapped the screen and hit play on the first voicemail, letting the audio fill my empty kitchen. It was my Aunt Beatrice, my mother's older sister. Her voice was trembling with exaggerated disappointment. "Zola, I just got off the phone with your mother and she is in absolute hysterics. I cannot believe you would treat your own flesh and blood this way. Your parents worked so hard to give you a good life and to build our family name. Now that you have a little bit of money, you think you are better than all of us. Trent is a good man, going through a hard time in a tough economy. You need to write that check and apologize to your sister before God punishes you for your greed. Call your mother back right now." I took a slow sip of my water and let the next message play. It was Uncle Marcus. He was loud, aggressive, and clearly had been drinking. "You listen to me, little girl. You do not ever turn your back on family. I do not care how many fancy corporate degrees you have, you are still Calvin and Yvonne's daughter. You are tearing this family apart over a few dollars and making your parents look bad. Fix this immediately." Then came the heavy hitter. Pastor Thomas from our family church. His voice was deep, smooth, and dripping with manipulative religious guilt. "Sister Zola, I am praying heavily for your soul tonight. The love of money is the root of all evil. God blessed you with your financial success in the corporate world so that you could be a blessing to your family in their time of need. Honoring your mother and father is not a suggestion, it is a strict commandment. Do not let your pride destroy your spirit and your relationships. I expect to see you at the church office tomorrow morning so we can pray together and get this unfortunate situation resolved." I listened to all of it without my heart rate increasing even a single beat. 10 years ago, those exact same voicemails would have sent me into a severe panic attack. I would have been crying, apologizing, and frantically transferring funds just to buy back their affection and stop the community shaming. But I was not that scared little girl anymore. The therapy had worked and the corporate world had hardened me. I deleted the voicemails one by one, permanently erasing their voices from my phone. I was not going to let them guilt-trip me into paying for Trent's massive financial failures. Instead of crying, I went to work. During the chaotic confrontation at the dinner table when my mother slammed the folder down and I used my napkin to wipe the gravy off the cover, I had done something else. I had quietly slipped my phone out of my lap and snapped a clear, high-resolution photograph of the first page of the default notice before I pushed it away. I opened the photo gallery on my phone and cast the image to my large desktop monitor in my home office. The bright screen lit up the dark room with the stark black and white text of the legal default notice. I zoomed in on the details, letting my trained corporate eyes scan the fine print. The lender was listed as Apex Holding Group. I frowned at the name. Apex was not a traditional bank or a standard venture capital firm. They were a shadow lender known in the private equity world for offering mezzanine debt and high-risk bridge loans at borderline illegal interest rates. They were the exact kind of ruthless lender you only went to when every legitimate financial institution in the city had already laughed you out of their lobby. I looked closely at the numbers. The principal loan was $500,000, but with the predatory interest rates, penalties, and late fees, the total debt had ballooned to $754,000 in less than a year. Trent had clearly been defaulting on these massive payments for months, all while driving around in a leased luxury car and pretending to be a self-made millionaire on the internet. But the math was not making any sense to me. Apex Holding Group was predatory, but they were not stupid. They would never hand over $500,000 in cold hard cash to an unemployed grifter with a fake business unless he had something incredibly valuable to back it up. There had to be a guarantor. There had to be collateral. You do not get a commercial loan that massive without signing over a hard physical asset. Trent did not own a house. He did not own the cars he drove. Dominique certainly did not have any assets in her name, other than her closet full of expensive designer handbags and shoes. So what did Trent use to secure this massive loan? I stared at the blurry edges of the photographed document, trying to read the truncated text at the very bottom of the page. It mentioned an addendum and a schedule of assets that I did not have a picture of. My phone buzzed again, lighting up with another angry text from my mother telling me I was a complete disgrace to the family name. I simply flipped the phone face down on the desk. They thought they could pressure me into blindly paying a massive bill just to save their social reputation. They thought I was just a wealthy wallet they could bully into submission, using church guilt and family loyalty. They forgot that I made my living completely destroying corrupt companies that tried to hide their bad debts. I closed the image on my screen and set my alarm for 5 in the morning. When the financial markets opened on Monday, I was going to unleash the full investigative power of my private equity firm on Trent's entire life and figure out exactly what he was hiding. The alarm on my nightstand went off at exactly 5 in the morning. I did not hit snooze because I never hit snooze. I got out of bed, walked into my master bathroom, and splashed cold water on my face. Today was Monday. In my family, Monday was just another day for my parents to play golf at the country club, and for Trent to pretend he was working from his laptop at an expensive local coffee shop. But in my world, Monday was a battlefield. I dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit, pulled my hair back into a sleek bun, and drove my car through the quiet, early morning streets of Atlanta, heading straight to the financial district. My firm occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming glass skyscraper right in the heart of the city. When I walked through the double glass doors, the receptionist nodded at me with deep professional respect. She wished me a good morning, and I offered a tight, polite smile before walking straight to my corner office. My office was a sanctuary of absolute power. It had a heavy oak desk floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city skyline and 4 massive computer monitors set up to track global markets. My family saw me as a stubborn, ungrateful daughter, but in this building, I was an apex predator. I was the person billionaire executives called when their companies were bleeding cash and they needed someone completely ruthless to restructure their assets. And today I was going to turn that exact same ruthless corporate energy onto my own brother-in-law. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and woke up my computers. I bypassed my usual morning market reports and opened our firm's proprietary investigative databases. These were advanced financial tools the general public did not have access to. They could track shell companies' offshore bank accounts and hidden corporate structures with just a few keystrokes. I typed in Trent's full legal name and hit enter. I started by looking for his supposed luxury car import business. At the dinner table, Trent had blamed his massive debt on global supply chain issues and cars being held up at international customs. I pulled up the state business registry to find his limited liability company. It took me less than 2 minutes to locate the public filing. Prestige Auto Imports, LLC. I clicked on the corporate documents and immediately let out a dry, hollow laugh. The registered business address was not a commercial warehouse or a high-end dealership showroom. It was a tiny mailbox rented at a generic shipping store in a rundown strip mall on the edge of town. I dug deeper, accessing commercial shipping manifests and customs declaration databases. If Trent was actually importing luxury vehicles from Europe or Asia, there would be a massive paper trail. There would be shipping containers, bills of lading import tariffs, and vehicle identification numbers. I ran comprehensive searches spanning the past 3 years. The database came back completely empty. 0 shipments, 0 vehicles imported, 0 customs fees paid. The entire business was a complete phantom. It existed only on his flashy social media page and in the highly delusional minds of my parents. So if there was no business, where did the money come from and where did it actually go? I pulled up the photograph I had taken of the default notice from Apex Holding Group and cast it onto my largest computer monitor. I needed to understand the exact anatomy of this specific debt. Normal people go to a traditional bank for a small business loan. They sit down with a loan officer and they show their tax returns, business plans, and profit margins. But Trent had no profit margins and no real business to speak of. No legitimate banking institution would ever lend him $754,000. That is exactly why he went to Apex. In the private equity world, we call firms like Apex lenders of last resort. They deal exclusively in high-risk venture debt and mezzanine financing. Their business model is entirely predatory by design. They target desperate people who have been rejected by traditional banks. They offer fast cash with minimal questions asked, but they attach crippling interest rates and incredibly aggressive penalty clauses. They are essentially corporate loan sharks operating just barely inside the boundaries of the law. I stared closely at the terms listed on the photographed page. The interest rate was absolutely staggering. It was mathematically designed to spiral out of control to ensure the borrower would eventually default on the payments. But Apex was a highly calculated firm run by incredibly smart people. They did not hand out $500,000 in initial principal based on a nice smile and a fake business card. They only issued these types of predatory loans when they were absolutely certain they could seize a physical asset worth twice as much as the original loan. They required hard, tangible collateral to secure their investment. The realization hit me like a splash of freezing ice water. Trent and Dominique had been lying to my parents about absolutely everything. They sat at that dining room table and played the perfect victims, crying about the tough economy and delayed cargo ships. But there were no cargo ships at all. There was no business failure because there was no business to begin with. The debt was not a temporary cash flow problem caused by a bad global market. It was a massive financial black hole that they had willingly jumped into. If Trent was not using the borrowed money to buy luxury cars, what exactly was he doing with hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure cash? You do not burn through that kind of money playing at being a fake entrepreneur on the internet. You burn through that kind of money when you are hiding a very dark and very expensive secret. Gambling debts, illegal narcotics, blackmail payments, extortion. My mind raced through all the terrifying possibilities. Whatever Trent was involved in it was highly dangerous, and it was accelerating out of control. My parents were blindly willing to sacrifice my entire financial security to protect him because they completely believed his carefully crafted lies. They truly thought they were saving a struggling, brilliant businessman. They had absolutely no idea they were throwing their money into a criminal void. And the most terrifying part of the entire situation was the missing collateral. Apex Holding Group was preparing to collect their debt, and those people never walked away empty-handed. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the heavy silence of my corner office pressing against my ears. I needed to know exactly where the money went and what asset Trent had leveraged to get it. It was time to stop looking at public records and start tracking the actual cash flow. I picked up my office phone and dialed the direct line to our firm's forensic accounting department. David, the head of our forensic accounting team, walked into my office less than 10 minutes after I called him. He is a quiet, intensely focused man who can find a hidden dollar in a maze of international shell companies. I handed him the photograph of the Apex Holding Group default notice and told him I needed to know exactly where the initial $500,000 principal went. I did not tell him it was my brother-in-law. In my firm, personal feelings do not dictate the workflow. I simply told him the borrower was a suspected fraud, and I needed a complete autopsy of his financial life. David nodded, took the printed image, and disappeared back into his department. For the next 3 hours, I sat at my desk and handled my regular corporate duties. I approved a merger for a medical supply company and restructured a struggling retail chain. But my mind kept drifting back to my parents' dining room. I kept picturing my mother standing over me, demanding I empty my own accounts to save Trent. She was so completely brainwashed by his blonde hair and his tailored suits that she never once bothered to look beneath the surface. My parents were so desperate to have a successful white businessman in the family, to show off to their elite black friends, that they ignored every single red flag. Just before noon, David knocked on my heavy oak door and walked in carrying a thick tablet. He sat down across from my desk and projected his findings onto my large wall monitor. The screen lit up with a chaotic web of wire transfers, offshore accounts, and shell companies. David did not look happy. He explained that Apex Holding Group wired exactly $500,000 to Trent's phantom company Prestige Auto Imports 6 months ago, but the money did not stay in that account for more than 48 hours. Trent did not buy a single car. He did not pay international customs fees. He did not invest in global shipping containers. Instead, the money was immediately split into two distinct financial streams. David tapped his screen and highlighted the first stream, which accounted for nearly $350,000 of the original loan. This money was washed through 3 different domestic shell companies before being wired to a series of unregulated offshore banks in the Cayman Islands and Macau. I asked David what kind of businesses operated out of those specific accounts. His answer made my blood run absolutely cold. They were high-stakes illegal sports betting syndicates and underground gambling rings. Trent was not an entrepreneur navigating a tough global economy. He was a degenerate gambler who had gotten himself into massive debt with very dangerous people. He took out the predatory loan from Apex just to cover his massive gambling losses and keep the bookies from breaking his legs. The sickening reality of it washed over me. My sister Dominique was sitting at home crying her eyes out, genuinely believing her husband was a stressed-out visionary. My parents were willing to disown their own flesh and blood just to protect a man who was literally throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars away on illegal football bets and backroom poker games. But the horror did not stop there. David brought up the second stream of money on the monitor. This was the remaining $150,000. Unlike the gambling money, this cash stayed right here in Atlanta. It was set up on a recurring monthly wire transfer to a luxury real estate management group in Midtown. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk, and asked David if Trent was secretly renting a commercial warehouse space for his fake business. David shook his head and pulled up a copy of a residential lease agreement. It was not a warehouse. It was a lease for a high-rise luxury penthouse apartment with a private balcony overlooking the city. Trent had prepaid a full year of rent in cash. I stared at the screen, feeling a deep twist of pure disgust in my stomach. I asked David, whose name was listed as the primary resident on the lease, because it certainly was not Trent's name. David tapped his tablet again, and a photograph appeared on the screen. It was a copy of a Georgia driver's license belonging to a 22-year-old girl. She had long blonde hair, heavy makeup, and a pouty expression. David explained that he had cross-referenced her name with Trent's hidden credit card statements. For the past 6 months, Trent had been using the remaining loan money to fund this girl's entire life. There were receipts for expensive lingerie trips to Miami, designer handbags, and weekly dinners at the most exclusive restaurants in the city. I sat back in my chair completely silenced by the sheer magnitude of his deception. My brother-in-law was living a complete double life. He was playing the role of the devoted, stressed-out husband at my parents' house while secretly funding a luxury penthouse for a mistress barely out of college. He was using stolen predatory loan money to buy her the exact same designer bags my sister loved to show off on her Instagram account. My parents worshipped the ground this man walked on. My mother praised him constantly at our church, telling everyone how blessed Dominique was to marry such a driven and successful man. My father treated him like the son he always wanted, taking him golfing and introducing him to all his wealthy friends. They demanded that I liquidate my hard-earned stock portfolio to save this absolute parasite. If I had listened to them, if I had let the religious guilt and the family pressure break me, I would have been directly funding Trent's illegal gambling addiction and paying the rent for his 22-year-old mistress. A cold, dark anger started to build inside my chest. It was not the loud, chaotic anger my family operated on. It was the quiet, focused rage of a corporate shark who has just found the weak spot in an enemy company. Trent thought he was a genius. He thought he could manipulate my desperate social climbing parents and use my wealth as his personal emergency fund. He thought he had covered his tracks perfectly. I thanked David and told him to print physical copies of every single wire transfer, the luxury penthouse lease, and every credit card receipt. I wanted a massive physical file I could hold in my hands. David nodded and left my office, closing the door softly behind him. I sat alone in the quiet room, staring at the smiling face of Trent's young mistress on my monitor. The debt was not a business failure. It was a calculated criminal betrayal. But as I looked at the numbers again, a much darker question suddenly hit me. Apex Holding Group did not care about Trent's mistress or his gambling debts. They only cared about their collateral. And I still did not know what physical asset Trent had used to secure a $500,000 loan in the first place. I turned back to my computer monitors, my mind racing through the possibilities. Trent did not own anything of value. His car was leased, his business was a ghost, and his luxury apartment was a temporary rental. Apex Holding Group was a firm of financial predators, and predators never took a blind risk. They required an ironclad guarantee. I opened a new secure tab on my browser and logged directly into the Fulton County Public Property Records database. I started typing in names. I searched for Trent, and the database returned 0 results. I searched for Dominique and found absolutely nothing. There was only one major asset in my entire family that held enough equity to secure a loan of that massive size. It was the one thing my parents valued above everything else in their lives: their sprawling brick estate in Buckhead. My parents had bought that massive house 20 years ago when their real estate brokerage first became highly successful. It was their ultimate status symbol. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on custom landscaping, a heated swimming pool, and imported marble floors. They hosted lavish charity dinners and church retreats just to show off their wealth to the community. My mother regularly invited the pastor and his wife over for brunch just to make sure everyone saw her imported crystal chandeliers and her custom granite countertops. They had paid off the final mortgage payment 5 years ago, and my father had proudly framed the clear title document and hung it in his home office. That house was their entire identity. My hands actually started to shake as I typed my father's legal name into the county database search bar. I hit enter and waited as the system pulled up the public property history. The screen refreshed, and a long list of legal documents appeared. I scrolled past the old mortgage records and the original deed of trust. My eyes locked onto the most recent filing dated exactly 6 months ago. It was a commercial lien against the property. The beneficiary of the lien was Apex Holding Group. I clicked on the document and downloaded the full 50-page digital file. I read through the dense legal jargon, my stomach dropping lower and lower with every single paragraph. Trent had not just borrowed $500,000. He had convinced my parents to sign away the equity in their fully paid-off dream home, to act as the primary collateral for his high-risk venture debt. The terms of the collateral agreement were absolutely brutal. Because it was a high-risk mezzanine loan, Apex Holding Group had inserted a rapid foreclosure clause. If the loan went into default and the balance was not paid in full, Apex had the legal right to seize the property and evict the residents within 30 days. And Trent had been missing his monthly payments for months. The final notice he brought to the dinner table was not a friendly warning. It was the final trigger. If that $754,000 was not paid immediately, my parents were going to lose their house. If the bank seized the house, there would be a public foreclosure notice taped to their heavy mahogany front doors. The wealthy neighbors in their exclusive gated community would see the moving trucks. The church congregation would find out. It would be the ultimate destruction of the perfect image my parents had spent 30 years carefully building. The shame would completely destroy my mother. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a wave of absolute shock wash over me. My parents were successful real estate brokers. They knew how property laws worked. They knew the extreme danger of leveraging a paid-off home for a commercial loan. So how did Trent manage to convince them to do it? He must have spun an incredible lie. He probably told them his luxury car import business was about to go public, or that he needed a temporary bridge loan for a massive international deal. He played on their greed and their blind worship of him. He manipulated their desire to have a wealthy white son-in-law, and they handed him the keys to their entire kingdom. Dominique definitely knew about this. She knew her husband had gambled away the money, and she knew her parents' home was on the chopping block. That is why she was crying so hysterically at the dinner table. She was not crying for Trent's fake business. She was crying because she knew she was about to be exposed as a fraud and her parents were about to become homeless. I sat in the quiet isolation of my corporate office staring at the lien document on my screen. A heavy, suffocating weight settled on my chest. I had a moral decision to make. I had all the proof sitting right in front of me. I had the bank transfers, the luxury apartment lease, the photos of the young mistress, and the legal property lien. I could pick up my phone right now and call my mother. I could tell her everything. I could warn her that her golden child and her perfect son-in-law had completely destroyed the family legacy. But as I reached for my phone, I stopped. I looked at the dark screen of my device and thought about every single interaction I had ever had with my parents. I thought about the voicemails my aunt and the pastor had left me calling me greedy and selfish. I thought about how my entire life I was told that my feelings did not matter and that my only purpose was to serve the family image. I thought about my father roaring at me from the head of the table, telling me I was no longer his daughter. If I called my mother, she would not believe me. She would immediately accuse me of fabricating the documents to ruin Dominique's marriage out of pure jealousy. If I showed my father the gambling debts, he would find a way to blame me for not supporting Trent earlier. Even worse, if they actually did believe the evidence, they would not turn on Trent. They would double down. They would panic about losing their house, and they would demand that I pay the $754,000 anyway just to save their social status and keep them from being homeless. They would expect me to sacrifice my life savings to cover up Trent's crimes so the church community would never find out. They did not want the truth. They only wanted my money. I slowly pulled my hand away from my phone. I was not going to call them. I was not going to warn them. They made their choice when they handed me that folder and gave me a 48-hour ultimatum. They chose to blindly trust a man who was actively destroying them while throwing away the only daughter who actually built her own success. The 48-hour clock was still ticking. I knew my parents could not handle the silence. They were used to bullying people into submission, and my refusal to engage was going to drive them absolutely crazy. I knew my mother was already plotting her next move, trying to figure out a way to trap me legally or manipulate me emotionally. I decided to wait. I gathered all the printed documents from the forensic accountant and placed them inside a thick black folder on my desk. I was fully armed with the truth, and I was ready for whatever trap my toxic family was preparing to set. I left the black folder sitting on the corner of my mahogany desk for the rest of the afternoon. It was a physical reminder of the absolute destruction my family was heading toward. Tuesday morning arrived and the 48-hour timer I had set was slowly ticking down. There was roughly 24 hours left before my father officially considered me disowned. I knew they were panicking. They were used to me caving in after a few angry text messages and a heavy dose of religious guilt from the pastor, but this time I had gone completely silent. In any negotiation, silence is the most terrifying weapon you can use against someone who is desperate. And my mother was nothing if not desperate. At exactly 10 in the morning, my cell phone lit up with an incoming call. The screen displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a deep breath to center myself before I finally pressed accept. I did not say hello. I just held the phone to my ear and waited for her to speak first. "Zola, sweetheart, are you there?" Her voice was incredibly soft and completely different from the vicious tone she had used on Sunday night. It was the sweet, fragile voice she used when she was talking to her wealthy friends at the country club, or when she wanted to convince my father to buy her a new piece of jewelry. "I am here, Mother." She let out a long, trembling sigh that sounded carefully rehearsed. "I am so glad you answered, Zola. I have not slept a single wink since you left the house. My heart is just completely broken. This family is falling apart and the stress is going to send your father to an early grave. We are all just hurting so much right now and we need to come together." I kept my expression completely blank, staring out the window at the Atlanta skyline. Are we hurting, Mother, or is Trent just finally facing the consequences of his own actions? She ignored the jab completely, diving right back into her script. "Your father was entirely out of line when he yelled at you and threatened you. You know how his temper gets when he is trying to protect his girls. He is just terrified for Dominique. We all are. But kicking you out of the family was wrong and I told him so. You are my daughter Zola. I carried you in my womb and I love you just as much as I love your sister. I hate seeing the two of you fighting over money like this." It took every ounce of my corporate training not to laugh out loud. She had not defended me. She had stood right next to him and called me cold and calculated. But this was her signature move, the fake olive branch. When aggression and bullying did not work, she pivoted immediately to playing the gentle peacemaker who was just trying to heal the family trauma. It was psychological warfare designed to make the victim feel crazy and drop their defenses. I did not say anything, letting the uncomfortable silence stretch out over the line. She finally cleared her throat and continued. "Your father and I had a very long talk with Trent and Dominique this morning. We realize it was unfair to ask you to bear this entire financial burden alone. It is a massive amount of money and you worked hard for your stock portfolio. So we came up with a compromise. A way to save Trent's business and keep the family united without draining your accounts all at once." "A compromise?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely neutral. "Yes, sweetheart. Trent spoke to his financial advisors and they drafted a shared payment plan. We are all going to pitch in to help clear this debt. Your father and I will cover a portion, and Trent is going to restructure his company to pay back the rest. We just need you to help us secure the bridge loan to buy us some time. It is a very simple legal arrangement and it protects everyone." I knew exactly what she was doing. There was no shared payment plan. Trent had 0 assets and 0 income to contribute. My parents had already leveraged their entire house to Apex Holding Group, so they had absolutely nothing left to offer. This was not a compromise. This was a highly orchestrated legal trap. They wanted to trick me into signing a document that would legally bind me to Trent's massive gambling debts and make me the primary guarantor. If I signed whatever document they had prepared, Apex Holding Group could legally seize my corporate assets and my penthouse the second Trent defaulted again. "We are meeting at Arthur Pendleton's office today at 2 in the afternoon," my mother said, her voice dripping with fake maternal warmth. "Please, Zola, just come to the office. Let us sit down as a family and look at the paperwork together. You do not have to commit to anything right now. Just come and listen. Do it for me." Arthur Pendleton was not just any lawyer. He was a sleazy defense attorney who played golf with Trent and handled all of my father's shady real estate zoning disputes. He was a snake in a very expensive suit, and he was completely loyal to my parents. Walking into his office to negotiate a contract was like walking into a cage with a starving lion. They were banking on the fact that I would be so relieved by their fake apology that I would blindly sign whatever Arthur put in front of me just to be welcomed back into the family. They thought I was weak. They thought my desire for their approval was stronger than my basic common sense. I looked down at the black folder sitting on my desk. Inside that folder was the absolute proof that Trent was a criminal, that he had a 22-year-old mistress, and that my parents were weeks away from losing their sprawling estate. I did not need to go to that meeting. I could have just told my mother the truth right then and there. But I realized something crucial. David, the forensic accountant, had only found the wire transfers and the property lien. We still did not have a copy of the original signed loan documents from Apex Holding Group. I needed to see exactly how Trent managed to pledge my parents' house as collateral without their knowledge. Or worse, I needed to know if my parents actually signed the documents willingly. Arthur Pendleton would have those original documents. If they wanted me to sign a shared payment plan, they would have to show me the original default notice and the collateral schedule. I picked up a pen and twirled it between my fingers. All right, Mother. I will be at Arthur's office at 2 o'clock. Oh, thank God. My mother breathed into the phone, her relief completely genuine, but for all the wrong reasons. Thank you, Zola. I knew you would do the right thing. I love you, sweetheart. We will see you soon. She hung up before I could say anything else. I tossed my phone onto the desk and let out a long breath. The fake truce had been offered and accepted. My parents and Trent were probably celebrating right now, thinking they had successfully manipulated the stubborn corporate daughter into bailing them out. They thought they had set the perfect legal trap to drain my wealth and protect their precious image. I stood up and straightened my charcoal suit jacket, picking up my leather briefcase. I was willingly walking right into their trap, but they had no idea I was bringing a flamethrower with me. I pulled my car into the reserved parking garage of Arthur Pendleton's downtown law firm exactly 5 minutes before 2 o'clock. The building was an imposing glass structure designed to make ordinary people feel small and intimidated. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor, gripping the handle of my leather briefcase. When I walked into the massive glass-walled conference room, my entire family was already sitting around a polished mahogany table. My mother, Yvonne, gave me a tight, nervous smile that looked more like a grimace. My father, Calvin, sat at the far end with his arms tightly crossed, trying to project an aura of absolute authority. Dominique and Trent were sitting close together, holding hands and trying to look like two innocent victims of circumstance. At the head of the table sat Arthur Pendleton. He wore a custom-tailored pinstripe suit and a heavy gold watch that flashed obnoxiously under the modern overhead lights. He stood up immediately and gave me a wide, predatory smile. Zola. My dear, it is so wonderful to see you, Arthur said, gesturing expansively to an empty leather chair directly across from him. Your parents have been telling me all about your massive success in the private equity world. Please have a seat. We are all here to get this unfortunate family misunderstanding sorted out quickly and quietly, so we can all move on with our lives. I sat down and placed my briefcase on the table without opening it. Let us skip the warm introductions, Arthur, I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and professional. My mother said you drafted a shared payment plan to handle Trent's massive financial failure. I would like to see it now. Arthur chuckled softly, trying his best to brush off my cold tone. He reached into his leather satchel and slid a thick, bound stack of paper across the polished wood. It landed directly in front of me with a heavy, dull thud. It had to be at least 50 pages long. Arthur leaned back in his expensive chair and steepled his fingers together, looking extremely pleased with himself. This is just a standard debt restructuring and shared liability agreement, he explained smoothly. It simply outlines how the family will pool their resources to protect Trent's business assets and satisfy the predatory lender. You just need to sign your name on the last page and we can all go home and enjoy the rest of our week. I did not flip to the last page. I opened the heavy document to page 1 and began reading the dense legal text line by line. The room went completely silent except for the sound of my slow, even breathing, and the occasional rustle of paper as I turned the pages. After about 5 agonizing minutes, Trent shifted uncomfortably in his chair, loudly clearing his throat. "Zola, it is really just standard boilerplate legal stuff," Trent said, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "Arthur made sure it protects all of us equally. You do not need to read every single word." I ignored him completely and kept reading. At page 12, I stopped and placed my index finger firmly on a specific paragraph. I looked up at Arthur, who was suddenly avoiding my direct eye contact. "Standard boilerplate," I asked, raising an eyebrow. "That is fascinating, Arthur, because Clause 4.2 under the guarantor obligations explicitly states that the primary liability of the original loan is transferred entirely to the undersigned party. It also states that the other listed family members are only responsible for secondary fractional payments at their own discretion." I turned my head slowly to look at my parents. "Did Arthur explain what that actually means, Mother?" "It means you and Dad are not legally required to pay a single dime toward this massive debt. It means if Trent misses another payment, the bank comes exclusively for my personal assets." My mother blinked rapidly, feigning complete ignorance. "Well, sweetheart, your father and I are on fixed incomes now. We just needed you to act as the strong financial anchor for the loan because you have the liquid capital. We will still pay you back under the table, I promise." I turned my attention back to the contract, flipping ahead to page 28. The legal jargon was incredibly dense, deliberately written to confuse and overwhelm anyone who did not spend their entire life tearing apart corporate contracts. I scanned the liability extension clauses and felt a cold, sharp smile touch the corners of my mouth. "But wait, it gets even better," I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls of the conference room. "Arthur, you really are a master of creative writing. Let us look closely at Clause 7.1 regarding future liabilities. It says the undersigned guarantor agrees to cross-collateralize the current debt with any future lines of credit opened by the primary borrower." I closed the thick document and pushed it hard across the table back toward the sleazy lawyer. "This is not a shared payment plan, Arthur. This is a blank check. If I sign this document, I am not just paying off the $754,000 Trent already lost. I am legally agreeing to be held personally responsible for every single dollar Trent borrows for the rest of his life. If he goes out tomorrow and takes out $1 million loan to fund another fake business, the bank can legally seize my penthouse to pay for it." Arthur dropped the friendly uncle act instantly. His face flushed a deep, angry red, and he leaned over the table trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "Listen to me very carefully, little girl," he snarled, dropping the professional tone completely. "You are playing a very dangerous game here. Apex Holding Group is not a bank you want to mess with. They will completely destroy your parents' financial lives. This contract is the only legal shield your family has left to stop the foreclosure process. I am doing you a massive favor by letting you absorb this debt cleanly, without it going to public court." I did not flinch. I let him finish his little speech, and then I laughed, a cold, sharp sound that made Trent physically jump in his seat. "Arthur, I am a senior partner at a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm," I said, leaning forward so I was looking directly into his angry eyes. "I negotiate hostile corporate takeovers with corporate lawyers who charge $3,000 an hour. Do you honestly think a strip mall attorney who plays golf with my unemployed brother-in-law can trap me with a poorly drafted cross-collateralization clause? I eat lawyers like you for breakfast." The entire room froze in absolute shock. My father looked completely furious that I was disrespecting his favorite attorney. My mother opened her mouth to start crying and launching another wave of emotional manipulation, but I held up my hand to stop her instantly. "You wanted me to review the paperwork, and I did," I said, speaking directly to my father. "But before we discuss any further terms regarding my money, I need to establish the exact legal foundation of the original debt." I turned back to Arthur, keeping my eyes locked onto his sweating face. "You represent Trent in this restructuring. Therefore, you must have the original loan documents from Apex Holding Group on file to draft this new agreement. I want to see them right now." I want to see the original default notice, the master loan agreement, and most importantly, the schedule of collateral that lists exactly what asset Trent pledged to secure the money in the first place. Arthur swallowed hard, the redness draining from his face as he realized I knew exactly what was missing from his trap. "Bring me the original signed documents, Arthur," I demanded, tapping my manicured fingernail against the mahogany table. "Show me exactly how my brother-in-law managed to secure a $500,000 loan without having a single penny to his name." The heavy silence in the conference room stretched out, making the air feel incredibly thick. Arthur Pendleton stared at me, his jaw tight with frustration. He looked over at my father as if asking for permission to deny my request. But my father Calvin was a businessman above everything else, and even he knew that demanding to see original loan documents was standard procedure. My father gave a short, stiff nod. Arthur let out a frustrated sigh and reached for his thick leather briefcase resting on the floor next to his chair. I watched Trent from the corner of my eye. His fake businessman posture had completely collapsed. He was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles were stark white. Dominique was staring at her lap, her breathing shallow and rapid. They were terrified. Arthur pulled a heavy blue folder from his briefcase and placed it reluctantly on the table. He did not push it toward me. "These are the original execution documents from Apex Holding Group," he said, his voice tight and defensive. "But I assure you, Zola, everything is in order. It is highly irregular for a third-party guarantor to demand an audit of the foundational paperwork during a simple restructuring meeting." "I am not a third-party guarantor, Arthur," I said, reaching across the table and pulling the blue folder directly out of his hands. "I am the only person in this room with enough liquid capital to save my parents from being homeless. That makes me the primary investor, and investors always read the fine print." I opened the blue folder. The paper was thick and professional, bearing the watermarks of a high-risk venture debt firm. I flipped past the standard interest rate disclosures and the aggressive penalty clauses that I had already seen on the default notice. I was looking for one specific section: the schedule of collateral. Page after page turned in the quiet room. My mother shifted in her chair, letting out a dramatic sigh to show how inconvenienced she was by my stubbornness. "Zola, please stop wasting our time," she whined softly. "Arthur already told you the house is backing the loan. We just need you to sign the shared payment plan so we can all go home and put this ugly mess behind us." I ignored her entirely. I reached the final section of the packet: the collateral pledge agreement. There it was in stark black and white. The legal description of my parents' sprawling brick estate in Buckhead, complete with the parcel number and the full assessed value. The document explicitly stated that the property was being pledged unconditionally to secure the $500,000 principal loan for Prestige Auto Imports. I turned to the very last page where the execution signatures were located. There were 4 lines at the bottom of the page. The first line held the signature of an Apex Holding Group executive. The second line held Trent's signature as the primary borrower. The third and fourth lines were reserved for the legal property owners. I stared at the blue ink resting on those bottom 2 lines. The names Calvin and Yvonne were written clearly, but something was entirely wrong. My father has signed thousands of real estate contracts in his lifetime. His signature is a sharp, aggressive scrawl that barely looks like letters. It is confident and heavy, pressing deeply into the paper. The signature on this page was slow and careful. The angles of the letters were too perfect, and the pressure of the pen was incredibly light. Then I looked at my mother's signature. My mother writes with a grand, sweeping elegance. She loops her letters beautifully, a habit she picked up in private school. But the signature sitting on the Apex loan document was shaky. The loops were uneven and cramped. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face perfectly still. I knew exactly who had signed these documents. When we were in high school, Dominique used to fail her math exams regularly. She was terrified of my father finding out, so she would spend hours at her desk practicing his signature on scrap paper until she could forge it perfectly on her report cards. The slow, careful angles of my father's fake signature on this federal loan document were the exact same angles my sister used to draw when she was 16 years old. My parents did not leverage their house to help Trent. They had absolutely no idea this collateral agreement even existed. Trent and Dominique had stolen the property deed from my father's home office and forged my parents' signatures to secure the predatory loan. My brother-in-law was not just a degenerate gambler with a secret mistress. My sister was not just a spoiled, entitled brat. They were both active federal criminals. They had committed wire fraud, real estate fraud, and aggravated identity theft to get their hands on $500,000. The trap Arthur had set for me suddenly made perfect sense. Arthur knew the signatures were forged. That was exactly why he drafted a 50-page restructuring agreement that legally transferred all the liability onto my shoulders. He was trying to bury the forged collateral document before Apex Holding Group triggered the foreclosure and brought in federal investigators. If I signed Arthur's contract, I would be legally assuming the debt and paying off the loan, which would make the entire fraud disappear forever. They were using my wealth to buy their way out of a federal prison sentence. "Zola, we really need to wrap this up," Arthur said, tapping his expensive gold watch. "The banks are closing soon. I need to review these terms carefully," I said, keeping my voice calm and completely devoid of emotion. I pulled my cell phone out of my blazer pocket. I opened the camera application and turned the shutter sound completely off. I tilted the blue folder slightly upward, shielding the pages from Arthur's view. I pretended to be checking a text message from my corporate office, but my thumb was rapidly pressing the capture button. I took high-resolution photographs of the forged signature page, the property description, and the notary stamp that Arthur had obviously faked to make the document look legitimate. "What are you doing?" my father demanded, his voice rising in anger. "Put your phone away and sign the damn paper, Zola." I slipped my phone back into my pocket and slowly closed the blue folder. I pushed it gently across the mahogany table back toward the sweating lawyer. I picked up my leather briefcase and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my charcoal suit. "I am not signing anything today," I said, looking directly at Arthur. My mother let out a loud, dramatic gasp, pressing her hand to her chest. "Zola, how could you be so cruel? We came all the way down here to compromise with you." "There is no compromise, Mother," I said, picking up my briefcase. "This debt is far more complicated than a simple cash flow problem. As a senior partner in a private equity firm, I have a strict legal obligation to perform extensive due diligence before assuming any third-party commercial liabilities. I am taking the weekend to have my own legal team review the structure of this loan." Arthur stood up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed into the glass wall behind him. "You cannot do that!" he shouted, losing his temper completely. "This contract has to be signed today. If Apex Holding Group initiates the default protocol, the entire estate goes into immediate foreclosure. You will destroy your parents." I looked at Trent, who was now openly sweating, a thick bead of moisture rolling down the side of his pale face. Dominique was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, her hands shaking violently in her lap. She knew that I knew. She saw me looking at the signatures, and she knew her entire life was about to violently collapse. "I suggest you prepare your clients for a very difficult weekend, Arthur," I said, turning my back on all of them. I walked out of the glass conference room, the sound of my father shouting my name echoing loudly down the quiet legal hallway. I did not stop. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage. As the elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of my angry family, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and looked at the crystal-clear photographs of the forged signatures. My sister and her husband had dug their own graves, and they had handed me the shovel. Now it was time to find out exactly who controlled the predatory firm that held their forged documents. The drive back to the financial district was a blur of adrenaline and cold clarity. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car, feeling the familiar weight of my cell phone in my pocket. Inside that phone were high-resolution photographs of a federal crime committed by my own flesh and blood. My parents had spent my entire life protecting Dominique, shielding her from every consequence and treating me like I was a burden. Now Dominique and her grifter husband had stolen our parents' most prized possession right out from under them. They had forged signatures on a legal document and handed the deed to a predatory lending firm just to pay off illegal gambling debts. I navigated the heavy Atlanta traffic, my mind running through all the possible legal scenarios. Arthur Pendleton thought he could intimidate me into signing my life away to protect Trent. He thought I was just a rich daughter desperate for family approval. But he fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I did for a living. I did not get to the top of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm by being soft. I got there by knowing exactly how to dismantle my opponents piece by piece. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of my office building. The cool, dark environment was a welcome relief from the suffocating heat of the afternoon sun. I took the private executive elevator straight up to the top floor. The doors slid open, revealing the quiet hum of high-level corporate activity. Analysts were walking through the glass hallways carrying stacks of financial reports. This was my domain. This was the world I built for myself while my sister was busy playing dress-up on social media. I walked straight past my assistant, giving her a brief nod, and went into my corner office. I shut the heavy oak door behind me, sealing myself off from the rest of the floor. I sat down at my desk and placed my leather briefcase on the floor. I took my phone out of my pocket and cast the photographs of the forged loan documents onto my large desktop monitor. The fake signatures of my mother and father glowed brightly against the dark screen. Trent had borrowed $500,000 from Apex Holding Group, and now with the predatory interest rates he owed them $754,000. Apex was the real enemy here. They were the ones holding the actual physical deed to my parents' sprawling brick estate. If I wanted to completely control this situation, I needed to know exactly who was running Apex Holding Group. I opened my firm's proprietary corporate tracking software. It was the same highly classified database David the forensic accountant had used earlier to track Trent's gambling money. I typed the name, Apex Holding Group, into the main search bar and hit enter. The system took a few seconds to process the request, searching through thousands of registries across the country. The screen refreshed, displaying a complex web of corporate ownership. Apex was not a simple standalone company. It was deeply buried under multiple layers of limited liability companies and offshore holding trusts. This was a classic corporate shielding tactic used by predatory lenders to avoid direct legal liability. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, and began to untangle the web. I clicked through the first layer of ownership, discovering a parent company registered in Delaware. I clicked on that parent company and found another holding trust, registered in the Cayman Islands. They were trying very hard to hide whoever was actually pulling the strings and collecting the massive interest payments. But I had unlimited access to the best financial tracking tools in the country. I spent the next hour systematically breaking down every single corporate wall they had built. I traced the money flowing from the local Atlanta office all the way up the endless corporate ladder. Finally, the software hit the absolute top of the ownership chain. The screen displayed the ultimate parent company that controlled the entire Apex Holding Group portfolio. I stared at the name, glowing in bold white letters on my monitor. My breath caught in my throat, and the entire room seemed to spin for a fraction of a second. I blinked twice, thinking my eyes were playing a trick on me after staring at the screen for so long. But the name did not change. The ultimate parent company was Vanguard Horizon Partners. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. Vanguard Horizon Partners was not a shadowy offshore trust. It was my private equity firm. It was the exact firm I was sitting inside right at this very moment. I quickly opened my secure internal email server and searched my recent executive memos. Just last week, while my family was busy planning their Sunday dinner ambush, I had been working 80-hour weeks finalizing a massive corporate acquisition. We had purchased a massive portfolio of distressed debt and high-risk lending firms to diversify our corporate assets. I opened the final acquisition contract that I had personally signed 3 days ago. There it was, buried on page 47 of the corporate merger agreement. Vanguard Horizon Partners had purchased an 80% controlling stake in Apex Holding Group. The magnitude of what this actually meant washed over me like a tidal wave. I was a senior partner at Vanguard Horizon Partners. I sat on the executive board. I had direct voting rights and absolute operational control over the distressed debt division. I did not just work for the company that bought Apex Holding Group. For all practical business intents and purposes, I was Apex Holding Group. Trent thought he was dealing with faceless corporate loan sharks who would just take the house and walk away. But he did not owe a faceless corporation. He owed me. I owned the $754,000 debt. I sat in my office chair, letting the absolute reality of my power wash over me. The predatory loan company that my family was terrified of was just another asset in my corporate portfolio. I looked at the digital clock on the corner of my computer screen. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. Exactly 48 hours ago, I was sitting at my parents' formal dining room table, wiping brown gravy off my silk blouse while my father pointed his heavy finger at me and told me I had 2 days to pay Trent's debt or be disowned. The deadline he had so arrogantly set had officially arrived. My cell phone buzzed against the smooth mahogany wood of my desk. I glanced down at the screen. It was a notification from the family group chat. My mother had been sending passive-aggressive messages all afternoon, asking if my corporate lawyers were done reading the shared payment plan yet. She kept typing about how Trent was having a panic attack and how Dominique was crying so hard she could not eat. My father had chimed in an hour ago demanding that I stop playing power games and bring the signed contract to the house before dinner. They still thought they were the ones completely in control. They still believed they were the puppet masters, and I was just a stubborn string they needed to pull a little harder. I picked up my phone, unlocking the screen with a slow, deliberate swipe. I opened the family group chat. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph explaining how they had betrayed me. I did not attach the high-resolution photographs of their forged signatures or the Cayman Islands bank statements showing Trent's illegal gambling debts. I simply typed 2 words: too late. I pressed send and watched the little blue text bubble appear on the screen. Then I set the phone face up on my desk and waited. It took exactly 4 seconds for the absolute chaos to begin. The screen lit up like a slot machine. My mother replied first, typing in all capital letters asking what I meant. Then my father sent a message demanding that I answer my phone right now. Then Dominique sent a string of crying emojis and asked if I was really going to let her husband go to jail. The text messages poured in so fast, they blurred together. Then the phone started vibrating violently as my father called me. I let it ring. As soon as it went to voicemail, my mother called. Then Trent called. The phone danced across the polished wood of my desk, buzzing relentlessly, with their loud, ignorant panic. I watched it ring, feeling a profound sense of peace. For 32 years, their loud voices had dictated my entire life. Their anger, their disappointment, and their demands had always been the loudest sounds in the room. But right now, in this quiet glass office, their panic was completely muted. They were screaming into the void, and I was simply watching the screen flash. I picked up my office phone and dialed the direct internal extension for the Director of Collections at our distressed debt division. A man named Harrison answered on the second ring. Harrison was a ruthless, efficient financial operator who managed the day-to-day collections for all the high-risk portfolios we had just acquired, including Apex Holding Group. Harrison, I need you to pull a specific commercial loan file from the Apex portfolio, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The borrower is a limited liability company called Prestige Auto Imports. The primary guarantor listed is Trent. I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard through the receiver as Harrison accessed the internal database. He found the file in less than 30 seconds. I have it right here, Zola, he said, his voice strictly professional. The account is severely delinquent. The total outstanding balance with accumulated interest and penalties is sitting at $754,000. Freeze the account, I commanded. Lock down every single line of credit associated with that name. If there are any remaining funds in the escrow accounts, I want them seized immediately to cover the administrative fees. Consider it done, Harrison replied, the typing sound accelerating. What about the collateral? The file shows a primary residential property located in Buckhead, backing the entire loan. It is a highly valuable estate. Do you want me to extend a grace period or send a standard warning letter to the listed property owners? No grace period, I said, staring out my office window at the darkening Atlanta skyline. The borrower has already been served with the final notice of default. I want you to initiate the rapid foreclosure protocol immediately. Draft the official eviction notices and file the property seizure paperwork with the county clerk's office first thing tomorrow morning. Harrison paused for a fraction of a second, clearly surprised by the aggressive speed of the order. You want to trigger a hard foreclosure right now. We usually give them a 30-day warning period before we file the physical paperwork with the county. The 48-hour warning period just expired. I told him, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Draft the paperwork tonight, Harrison. I want a private courier to deliver the official foreclosure notice directly to the front door of that property tomorrow morning. And I want the documents printed on the official Vanguard Horizon Partners legal letterhead, not the Apex Holding Group stationery. I want them to know exactly who is taking their house. Understood, Zola, Harrison said, completely shifting back into his cold corporate mode. I will have the legal team draft the eviction notices immediately. The courier will be dispatched at 8 in the morning. Is there anything else regarding this specific file? Yes, I said, picking up my cell phone, which was still flashing with missed calls from my frantic family. The signatures on the property collateral agreement are forged. The borrower committed wire fraud and identity theft to secure the funds. I want you to prepare a comprehensive federal fraud report and have it ready to submit to the authorities, but do not send it to the FBI just yet. Keep it on your desk until I give you the explicit green light. Harrison let out a low whistle over the line. Fraud and forged property deeds. This guy is going to federal prison for a very long time. I will have the fraud packet ready for your final approval by tomorrow afternoon. I thanked Harrison and hung up the receiver. The snare was officially set and the trapdoor was wide open. I looked back down at my cell phone. The group chat was completely unhinged now. My father was threatening to drive down to my office and drag me out by my hair. My mother was leaving dramatic voice notes saying she was having chest pains and needed an ambulance because of my cruel behavior. They were putting on a massive theatrical performance, trying to use guilt and anger to force me back into my designated role as the obedient ATM machine. They had absolutely no idea that while they were busy typing angry text messages and making empty threats, I had just quietly pressed the button that would dismantle their entire lives. I packed my leather briefcase, turned off my office lights, and walked out to my car. Tomorrow, they were going to wake up in their perfect brick mansion, thinking they still had the upper hand. And then the courier was going to knock on their heavy mahogany front door and deliver the ultimate reality check. I arrived at my office the next morning at my usual time, carrying a fresh cup of coffee and feeling completely rested. The financial markets were opening and my day was packed with executive meetings, but a quiet anticipation hummed in the back of my mind. It was exactly 8:15 when the private courier I had hired would be walking up the long, winding driveway of my parents' Buckhead estate, holding the official eviction notice from Vanguard Horizon Partners. I settled into my leather chair, turned on my monitors, and started reviewing a merger portfolio. I expected my phone to start ringing by 8:30. I expected angry voicemails and frantic text messages demanding an explanation. What I did not expect was the sheer volume of the commotion that erupted outside my office doors an hour later. At exactly 9:20, the heavy glass doors of my corner office flew open so violently they banged against the walls. My assistant Maria stood in the doorway looking completely terrified. Zola. I am so sorry, she stammered, her eyes wide with panic. I tried to stop them, but they just pushed right past security. They are making a massive scene in the main lobby and the senior partners are starting to notice. Before she could finish her sentence, my mother pushed past her, marching into my office like she owned the entire building. She was wearing a very expensive designer suit, her hair perfectly styled, but her face was completely flushed with absolute rage. Right behind her came my father, his chest puffed out aggressively. Trent and Dominique trailed in last, looking pale and terrified, holding a thick stack of papers that I immediately recognized as the official foreclosure documents. "How dare you!" my mother screamed, her voice echoing loudly out into the quiet corporate hallway. "We give you life, we raise you in luxury, and you send an eviction notice to our front door. You are a monster, Zola. You are a cold, heartless monster." Several junior analysts and a few senior executives stopped what they were doing and looked over their cubicle walls, staring openly at the spectacle unfolding in my doorway. In the high-stakes world of private equity, public emotional outbursts are considered professional suicide. My parents knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to humiliate me in front of my peers. They wanted to drag my reputation through the mud, hoping I would cave to their demands just to stop the public embarrassment. It was their classic bullying tactic brought directly into my corporate sanctuary. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked at them with complete detached amusement. "Maria," I said, speaking calmly to my terrified assistant, "please escort my family into conference room B, the soundproof one at the end of the hall, and hold all my calls for the next 30 minutes. "I am not going into any conference room," my father bellowed, slamming his hand against the doorframe. "We are going to settle this right here in front of everyone so they can see exactly what kind of ruthless, backstabbing executive you really are. You own the company that holds our mortgage and you never said a single word. You sat at that table and watched us beg while you held the power to fix everything." I finally stood up slowly, buttoning the front of my suit jacket. I walked around my desk and stopped just a few feet away from my red-faced father. "If you want to shout about your financial failures in the middle of my firm, that is your choice, Dad." I said, my voice low enough that only they could hear the absolute venom in it. "But before you scream any louder, you might want to look at exactly who is standing in conference room B right now." My father frowned, following my gaze down the long glass hallway. At the very end of the corridor inside the large glass-walled conference room, two men wearing dark suits were sitting quietly at the long table. They did not look like bankers or corporate lawyers. They had the stiff, upright posture of law enforcement. "Who are they?" Trent asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Those are the men who are going to decide whether you leave this building through the front door or in the back of a federal cruiser," I replied, locking eyes with Trent, until he physically stepped back. "Now you have a choice. You can keep screaming in my lobby, and I will have security physically drag you out to the curb, or you can walk into that conference room, and we can have a quiet family discussion about forged signatures and wire fraud." The color instantly drained from Trent's face, leaving him looking sick and gray. Dominique's mouth fell open, her eyes darting nervously between me and the two men down the hall. Even my father, who rarely backed down from a confrontation, seemed to realize that he had completely lost the upper hand. He grabbed my mother's arm and pulled her roughly toward the hallway. "Fine," my father muttered through clenched teeth. "Let us go to the conference room, but you better have a damn good explanation for this, Zola." I watched them march down the hallway, their earlier arrogance completely replaced by a tense, suffocating fear. I turned to Maria, who was still standing by the door, clutching her tablet. "Thank you, Maria," I said softly. "Close my office door and make sure nobody interrupts us. This is going to be a very messy demolition." I picked up the thick black folder from my desk, the one containing the forensic accountant's report, the photos of Trent's mistress, and the clear images of the forged loan documents. I walked slowly down the hallway, the heavy carpet absorbing the sound of my footsteps. I could see them through the glass walls of the conference room, sitting rigidly across from the two men in dark suits. My parents looked furious but confused, while Trent and Dominique looked like they were waiting for an executioner. I placed my hand on the heavy glass door, taking one final deep breath before stepping inside. The public humiliation attempt was officially over. It was time for the controlled demolition to begin. I pushed open the heavy glass door of conference room B and walked inside, letting the door click shut behind me, sealing us in absolute silence. The two men in dark suits sat perfectly still at the far end of the long mahogany table. They were federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division, and they had already been briefed on everything. They did not say a word when I walked in, they just watched. My father, Calvin, slammed his hands flat on the table the moment I took my seat at the head of the room. He pointed his finger at me, his face twisted in a mask of absolute fury. "You call whatever department sent that notice, and you cancel it right now," he demanded, his voice shaking with rage. You own the company holding our deed, Zola. You have the power to make this go away with one phone call. I am not going to let you humiliate your mother and me in front of our neighbors because you want to throw a temper tantrum. My mother crossed her arms over her chest, nodding along with him. You are acting like a spoiled child, Zola. She scolded, her tone dripping with condescension. Trent made a bad business deal, and now you are punishing all of us just to prove a point. Stop this nonsense right now and call your bank. I did not reach for my phone. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of emotion. I simply unclasped the heavy leather flap of my briefcase and pulled out the thick black folder David the forensic accountant had prepared for me. I placed it flat on the polished wood and slid it slowly down the length of the table. It stopped directly in front of my father. Before I make any phone calls, I suggest you open that folder, Dad, I said, leaning back in my chair. Because you are right about one thing. I do own the company that holds your mortgage, and as the primary investor, I have the right to know exactly where my $500,000 went. My father glared at me, but his curiosity and his desperate need to regain control got the better of him. He flipped open the heavy black cover. My mother leaned over his shoulder to look. The very first page was a brightly colored pie chart breaking down the exact flow of the predatory loan money accompanied by copies of offshore wire transfers. What is this? My father asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. These are international bank records. What does this have to do with Trent's car import business? There is no car import business, I explained, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. Prestige Auto Imports does not exist. It is a fake company registered to a shipping store mailbox. Trent never imported a single vehicle. Instead, he took your house and used it to secure a $500,000 cash loan from my company. He then wired over $300,000 of that money to illegal sports betting syndicates in the Cayman Islands and Macau. My mother gasped, stepping back from the table as if the folder had physically burned her. That is a lie, she stammered, looking frantically at Trent. Tell her it is a lie, Trent. Tell her you were investing in global markets. Trent did not say a word. He was staring down at his hands, completely paralyzed by fear. His silence was louder than any confession. But my parents were not ready to let go of their perfect white son-in-law. My father shook his head vigorously, tapping the paper. No, there has to be a mistake here, Calvin insisted blindly. He was probably defrauded by a foreign broker. Trent is a smart boy. He would not throw away $500,000 on football games. You are manipulating the data, Zola, just to make him look bad. I felt a cold smirk touch my lips. Turn to the next page, Dad. Tell me how I manipulated that. My father turned the page. Staring up at him was a crisp, high-resolution photograph of a 22-year-old blonde girl wearing designer sunglasses and holding a tiny dog. Pinned beneath the photograph was a copy of a 12-month residential lease agreement for a luxury penthouse apartment in Midtown Atlanta. That is the remaining $150,000 of the loan, I said, watching my mother's face drain of all color. Your brilliant son-in-law used it to prepay a full year of rent for his mistress. He has been buying her luxury cars, designer handbags, and expensive vacations, using the equity from the house you spent 30 years paying off. The room went dead silent, the illusion shattered completely. My mother let out a small, broken sound, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She looked at Trent with absolute disgust, finally seeing the parasite he truly was. Then she turned her attention to my sister Dominique, who was sitting next to Trent, with tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my sweet baby!" my mother cried, rushing over to Dominique and wrapping her arms around her shoulders. "I am so sorry, Dominique. He tricked you. He tricked all of us. We had no idea he was doing this to you." But Dominique did not lean into our mother's embrace. Instead, she physically pushed our mother away, letting out a loud, ugly sob. "Stop it, Mom," she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her own guilt. "Stop treating me like a child." My mother stood frozen, totally confused. "What are you talking about, sweetheart? He lied to you." "He did not lie to me," Dominique yelled, crying so hard she could barely breathe. "I knew about her. I knew about the apartment and the gambling. I found the text messages on his phone 4 months ago." My father looked like he had just been physically struck. You knew, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. You knew he was sleeping with another woman and gambling away our house, and you did not say a single word. Dominique buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically. What was I supposed to do? She cried. If I exposed him, he would have cut off the credit cards. I needed the money to maintain my lifestyle. I have 60,000 followers on Instagram, Mom. I am a luxury lifestyle influencer. I could not just post that my husband was a broke, cheating loser. I had an image to maintain. So we made a deal. I let him keep his little girlfriend, and he kept buying me whatever I wanted using the loan money. I thought he would figure out a way to pay the bank back before they took the house. The absolute sickness of her confession hung heavy in the air. My parents had spent their entire lives treating Dominique like a fragile golden child who could do no wrong. They had demanded I sacrifice my entire life savings to protect her pure, innocent heart. And now they were staring at the reality. Their golden child had willingly sold their home and allowed her husband to commit massive financial crimes just so she could keep pretending to be rich on the internet. My father slowly sank into an empty chair, looking suddenly very old and very tired. My mother stood completely still, staring at Dominique, as if she were a total stranger. The perfect family image they had sacrificed everything for was completely dead. But I was not finished yet. The cheating and the gambling were just moral failures. It was time to address the actual federal crimes. I watched my parents process the absolute destruction of their perfect son-in-law, but I knew the worst blow was still coming. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany table. Turn to the very last page in the folder, Dad, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. My father looked at me, his eyes hollow and defeated. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand and turned the heavy cardstock page. Pinned to the inside of the back cover were the high-resolution photographs I had taken in Arthur Pendleton's office. They were crystal-clear images of the original collateral pledge agreement from Apex Holding Group. My father stared at the document for a long time. His real estate background kicked in, and his eyes automatically scanned the legal description of the property. I watched his face turn from a pale gray to a sickening shade of white. He recognized the parcel number. He recognized the address of his own sprawling estate. "What is this?" he whispered, looking up at me with sheer terror in his eyes. "This is a commercial property lien. Why is my home address listed on a mezzanine debt contract?" My mother snapped out of her shock over the mistress and rushed to my father's side. She leaned over his shoulder, reading the legal text. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. "Calvin, what does that mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why is our house on Trent's loan paperwork?" I did not let my father answer her. I answered for him. Because Apex Holding Group does not hand out $500,000 to unemployed men with fake businesses, I explained. They require hard physical collateral. Trent did not have any assets, so he used the only thing of value he had access to. He pledged your fully paid-off home as the unconditional guarantee for his gambling money. My father shook his head violently. "No, that is impossible," he stammered. "We hold the physical deed in the safe in my home office. We never signed any transfer paperwork. We never went to a notary. A commercial lender cannot just take a house without the owner's legal consent." "Look at the bottom of the page, Dad," I said, pointing to the photograph. "Look at the execution lines." My father looked down at the signature block. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he saw his own name written in blue ink right next to my mother's name. I watched him trace the slow, careful angles of the forged signature with his shaking index finger. He knew instantly. He had spent years watching Dominique forge his signature on her high school report cards because she was too lazy to study. The distinct, rigid handwriting was an exact match. He slowly lifted his head and looked directly at Dominique. "You forged my name," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. "You stole the deed from my office safe, and you forged our signatures to give our home to a loan shark." Dominique shrank back into her leather chair, pressing herself against Trent. "No, Daddy, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Trent told me it was just a temporary bridge loan. He said he would pay it back in a month and you would never even know the house was leveraged. He made me do it. He said he would leave me if I did not help him get the money. Trent jumped out of his chair, his face twisted in pure panic. "Do not listen to her!" he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at his own wife. It was her idea. She knew exactly where the safe key was. She told me the house was paid off, and she volunteered to sign the papers because she wanted to keep buying her designer bags. I did not forge anything. She committed the fraud, not me. "You lying coward!" Dominique screamed, launching herself out of her chair and shoving Trent hard in the chest. "You took the money and spent it on that little blonde girl while you told me we were building a future. You ruined my life." The illusion of their perfect marriage shattered completely into a million jagged pieces. They stood in the middle of the corporate conference room screaming vicious insults at each other, exposing every lie and every betrayal they had hidden for years. But the real explosion came from my father. Calvin let out a raw, guttural roar that shook the glass walls. He lunged across the space between the chairs and grabbed Trent by the lapels of his expensive custom suit. He slammed the younger man against the glass wall so hard the entire pane rattled. "You stole my home!" My father roared, his face inches from Trent's terrified eyes. "I welcomed you into my family. I treated you like my own son. I defended you against my own daughter, and you stole the roof over my head to pay for your filthy gambling habits. I will kill you with my bare hands." "Calvin." "Stop," my mother shrieked, grabbing his arm and trying to pull him back. "You are going to have a heart attack. Let him go." But my father was completely blind with rage. The two federal agents who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table immediately stood up. They moved with swift, professional precision. One agent grabbed my father's shoulders and pulled him forcefully away from Trent, while the other stepped between them, creating a physical barrier. "Step back right now, sir," the lead agent commanded, his voice projecting undeniable authority. "Take a seat and calm down, or you will be restrained." My father stumbled backward, falling heavily into his chair. He buried his face in his hands, taking ragged, gasping breaths. He was a proud, wealthy man who had built an empire from nothing, and in the span of 20 minutes, he had discovered that he was entirely bankrupt. His golden child was a felon, his perfect son-in-law was a grifter, and he was about to be evicted from his own home. My mother turned her absolute devastation onto Dominique. "How could you do this to us?" she sobbed, hitting her own chest with her fists. "We gave you everything, Dominique. We bought you whatever you wanted. We paid your private school tuition. We bought your cars. We defended you against everyone. We almost disowned your sister just 2 days ago because we believed your lies. And you repay us by making us homeless. You are no daughter of mine. You are a selfish, disgusting criminal." Dominique collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands covering her ears as if she could block out the reality of her actions. "Mom, please," she wailed. "I am sorry. I will fix it. I will get a job and pay you back. I swear I will fix it." "Pay us back with what?" my father shouted, his voice cracking with despair. "You owe $754,000. You have never worked a real day in your life. You play dress-up on the internet while your husband sleeps with college girls and gambles away our retirement. There is no fixing this. We are ruined." The family loyalty they had preached about my entire life, the blind devotion they had weaponized to manipulate me, had completely evaporated. They always told me that blood was thicker than water, and that family must always stick together no matter what. But that was only true when it was my money on the line. When the money ran out, and the truth was exposed, they turned on each other like starving animals. They threw each other under the bus without a single second of hesitation. Trent was willing to send his wife to prison to save himself, and my parents were willing to verbally destroy the daughter they had worshipped for 29 years. I sat at the head of the table watching the utter devastation unfold with complete detachment. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel any lingering guilt or sadness for the people screaming in my conference room. I just watched the toxic foundation of my family finally collapse under the heavy weight of its own lies. I looked over at the lead federal agent who was still standing between my father and Trent. The agent's eyes met mine, and I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. The personal demolition was complete. It was time for the legal system to take over. My father lifted his heavy head from his hands and looked at me across the long, polished mahogany table. The violent, aggressive rage that had just consumed him was completely gone. In its place was a pathetic, hollow desperation that I had never seen on his face before. He looked like a drowning man desperately searching for a lifeline in a storm. "Zola, please!" He begged, his voice cracking under the weight of his own panic. "You have to stop this right now. You have the money. You have millions in your corporate stock portfolio. You can pay Apex Holding Group and clear this lien before they take our house. We will pay you back, I swear to you on my life. I will come out of retirement and work every single day until you are entirely repaid. Just please do not let those corporate loan sharks take our home." My mother crawled over to my side of the table and reached out to grab my hand. I pulled my arm away before her fingers could even brush against my suit sleeve. "Zola," she cried, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. "We are so incredibly sorry. We were so blinded by Trent we simply did not see what he was doing behind our backs. But you are our flesh and blood daughter. You are strong and highly successful, and you have the absolute power to fix this nightmare. Call your bank right now and wire the money to Apex Holding Group. Buy the house back for us. Please, sweetheart, do not let your own parents become homeless." I sat perfectly still and looked at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was absolutely nothing. They were begging me to save them from a massive financial disaster they had actively helped create by enabling my toxic sister. They still did not understand the true reality of the situation. They still thought they were dealing with a faceless corporate entity that could simply be paid off and forgotten. They still believed that enough tears and enough begging would force me to open my wallet and save their precious social status. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool surface of the table. "I am not going to wire any money to Apex Holding Group," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady, echoing loudly in the quiet room. My father's face twisted in sheer terror. "Why not?" he pleaded, leaning toward me. "You can afford this, Zola. You make millions of dollars every single year. Why would you willingly let a predatory lender take your childhood home when you have the financial power to stop them today?" I looked directly into his desperate eyes. "Because, Dad, you do not understand how corporate acquisitions actually work. I did not just look up the offshore wire transfers and the forged documents on a public internet database. I used my firm's highly classified internal corporate tracking software. Last week, while you and Mother were busy planning your little Sunday dinner ambush to force me to pay Trent's gambling debts, my private equity firm closed a massive corporate merger. We purchased a huge international portfolio of distressed debt companies and predatory lending firms." My father frowned heavily, his mind struggling to connect the financial dots through his blinding panic. "What does your private equity firm have to do with this loan?" he asked, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Everything," I said, letting a slow, cold smile touch my face for the first time. Vanguard Horizon Partners bought an 80% controlling stake in Apex Holding Group last Thursday. I am a senior partner at Vanguard Horizon Partners. I sit on the executive board. I have absolute operational control over the entire distressed debt division. The conference room went completely still. Even Dominique stopped her hysterical sobbing and looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Trent stopped breathing entirely. "I do not owe Apex Holding Group a single dime," I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a razor blade. "You do not owe a faceless corporate bank in another state. You owe me. I own the $754,000 debt. I hold the forged deed to your house. And I am the one foreclosing on the property." The sheer magnitude of the drop hit my father like a physical blow to the chest. He physically slumped back into his heavy leather chair, his mouth hanging open in absolute disbelief. He stared at me as if I had just grown a second head. My mother let out a small, choked gasp, covering her mouth with both of her shaking hands. They finally realized that the monster they had been fighting all week was not some distant corporate loan shark. It was the daughter they had abused, neglected, and pushed aside for 32 years. "You are the bank," my father whispered, his voice completely devoid of life and hope. "Yes, Dad. I am the bank," I replied, folding my hands together. "And the bank does not care about your perfect family image. The bank does not care about your wealthy country club friends or your prestigious church reputation. The bank only cares about the forged collateral that was illegally pledged to secure stolen funds." "You cannot do this!" my mother screamed, suddenly finding her voice again and slamming her fists on the table. "You cannot evict your own parents from their home. We gave you life, Zola. We raised you under that roof. You have to forgive this debt right now. You have to give us our house back." "I gave you 48 hours to back down," I reminded her coldly. "I walked out of your house on Sunday and you immediately unleashed your flying monkeys on me. You had the pastor and my aunts leave me threatening voicemails calling me a greedy monster. You tried to trap me in a fake legal contract with a sleazy lawyer yesterday so I would be held personally liable for Trent's gambling debts forever. You made your choice, Mother. You chose the golden child and the perfect white son-in-law over me. Now you get to live with the absolute consequences of that choice. The house belongs to my corporate portfolio now, and you have exactly 30 days to pack your things and get out." The finality of my words hung in the air like a heavy death sentence. There was absolutely no negotiation left. There were no more emotional manipulation tactics they could possibly use against me. I had completely stripped them of their power, their assets, and their false dignity. But the financial ruin was only the first part of the punishment. Trent suddenly jumped up from his chair. His pale face was slick with sweat, and his eyes were darting wildly around the room looking for a way out. He finally realized that the corporate execution was over and the legal execution was about to begin. "Wait, if Zola owns the company?" Trent stammered, his voice high and thin with absolute terror. "Then she can just cancel the federal fraud report. We can just walk away from this right now. Nobody has to go to jail. We can just sign the house over quietly and forget this ever happened." I turned my head slowly and looked at the two men in dark suits who had been sitting silently at the far end of the long conference table. They had not spoken a single word since the meeting began. They had simply watched and listened as my family confessed to multiple federal crimes right in front of them in a soundproof room. I stood up from my chair and smoothed the wrinkles from my charcoal suit jacket. "Trent, I think it is time you officially met my colleagues," I said, gesturing gracefully toward the two men. The lead agent stood up immediately, followed by his partner. They reached into their suit jackets and pulled out their official badges, letting them hang from metal chains around their necks. They were not corporate lawyers or private investigators. They were federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. Trent let out a strangled cry of pure terror. He did not even try to formulate another lie or excuse. He simply turned around and bolted for the heavy glass door of the conference room. He actually thought he could outrun the consequences of his actions, just like he had his entire life. He did not make it more than 3 steps. The younger federal agent moved with terrifying speed and precision. He crossed the room in an absolute blur, intercepting Trent before his hand even touched the glass door handle. The agent grabbed Trent by the back of his expensive custom suit jacket, spun him around forcefully, and slammed him face first against the thick glass wall. The impact rattled the entire room, making my mother scream in shock. "Get your hands behind your back right now!" the agent barked, his voice commanding and absolute. Trent offered absolutely no physical resistance. He went completely limp, sobbing openly like a small child as the cold, heavy metal handcuffs clicked securely around his wrists. Dominique watched her husband get thrown against the wall and arrested, and her toxic survival instincts immediately kicked in. She scrambled out of her chair and backed away from them, pointing a violently shaking finger at Trent. "It was all him," she screamed hysterically, trying to save herself. "I did not do anything wrong. He forced me to sign those property papers. He threatened to leave me. I am a victim here. You cannot arrest me because I am a victim." The lead agent walked slowly around the mahogany table and stopped right in front of my sister. He reached down to his dark leather belt and pulled out a second pair of steel handcuffs. "Dominique Wilson," he said, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "You are under arrest for federal conspiracy to commit wire fraud." real estate fraud, and aggravated identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. No, my mother shrieked, throwing herself forward and trying to grab the federal agent's arm. You cannot take my baby away. She is just a little girl. She did not know what she was doing. Please do not put those handcuffs on her. She is fragile. The agent easily stepped out of my mother's frantic reach. Mom, if you interfere with a federal arrest, I will place you in handcuffs as well and charge you with obstruction, he warned her sternly. My father reached out and grabbed my mother's waist, pulling her back roughly. He was completely broken, but he was not stupid. He knew fighting the FBI would only end with all of them sitting in a federal prison cell. Dominique screamed and thrashed wildly as the agent grabbed her arms and secured her wrists tightly behind her back. She looked over her shoulder at me, her face twisted in pure, ugly hatred. I hate you, Zola, she screamed at the top of her lungs, tears streaming down her face. I will always hate you for doing this to me. You completely ruined my life. I looked at my sister, the golden child who had spent 29 years taking everything she wanted and destroying anyone who got in her way. You ruined your own life, Dominique, I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady. I just stopped paying for it. The agents grabbed Trent and Dominique firmly by their arms and marched them toward the conference room door. The sound of their loud sobbing and angry screaming echoed out into the quiet corporate hallway as they were led away to the secure freight elevators. My parents stood entirely alone in the empty conference room, watching their perfect family image completely disappear in steel handcuffs. The heavy silence that followed was incredibly absolute, but for the first time in my entire life, it felt deeply peaceful. I watched the heavy glass door swing shut, completely sealing my parents and me inside the quiet conference room. The reality of what had just happened settled over them like a suffocating blanket. My mother, Yvonne, let out a low, guttural wail that sounded like a wounded animal. Her legs completely gave out beneath her and she collapsed onto the expensive corporate carpet right in front of my chair. She did not care about her designer suit or her perfectly styled hair anymore. She crawled toward me on her hands and knees, looking up at me with a face entirely destroyed by grief and absolute terror. Zola, please, she sobbed, grabbing the hem of my charcoal skirt. Please, you have to stop them. You have to call those men back right now and tell them it was all a big mistake. You cannot let them put Dominique in a federal prison. She is your little sister. She will not survive in a place like that. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was cold and selfish. I did not reach out to comfort her. I did not pull my skirt away from her desperate grip. I just looked at her with complete emptiness. I cannot call them back, Mother, I said, my voice flat and emotionless. They are federal agents, not corporate security guards. Dominique committed federal wire fraud and forged your signature on a commercial real estate lien. The government is pressing those charges now, not me. I simply handed them the evidence they needed to do their jobs. She shook her head violently, tears flying from her face and spotting the carpet. No, she cried loudly. You have the power to fix this, Zola. You own the company holding the debt. You can tear up the foreclosure papers and forgive the loan. If you drop the financial claims, the FBI might let her go with a warning. You can give us our house back, and we can hire a good lawyer for Dominique. We can put this all behind us and be a real family again. I looked over at my father, Calvin. He was still slumped in his leather chair, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the last 20 minutes. His proud, broad shoulders were completely hunched over, and the arrogant fire that usually burned in his eyes was totally extinguished. Calvin, tell her, my mother begged, reaching out a shaking hand toward him. Tell your daughter to save our house. Tell her to save our family. My father slowly lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were red and swollen. Zola, he whispered, his voice breaking. I know we made mistakes. I know we favored your sister, and I know I was completely wrong about Trent. But we are still your parents. I built that house with my own 2 hands. It is our entire legacy. You cannot just evict us and leave us with absolutely nothing. What will our church community say? What will our friends think when they see the bank seizing our property? Please, Zola, I am begging you, as your father, do not do this to us. I listened to their pleas and I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no sadness, no lingering desire for their approval. Their tears were not falling because they realized they had abused me for 32 years. Their tears were falling because they were terrified of losing their social status and their perfect public image. They were still only thinking about what the neighbors and the country club members would say. I stood up slowly, forcing my mother to release the hem of my skirt. I picked up my empty leather briefcase from the floor and placed it on the table. 2 days ago, I sat at your dining room table, I said, looking down at both of them. You threw a predatory loan document in my face and told me it was my absolute duty to drain my hard-earned stock portfolio to pay for Trent's mistakes. You told me I was selfish. You told me I was a terrible daughter. My mother wept loudly, burying her face in her hands. We did not mean it, she sobbed. We were just stressed. You meant every single word I said, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. And then, Dad, you stood up and delivered your final ultimatum. You told me that if I did not pay the $754,000 in exactly 48 hours, I was no longer your daughter. You told me to walk out of your house and consider myself completely disowned. My father flinched as if I had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I accepted your terms, Dad. I continued staring directly into his defeated eyes. I walked out of your house and I let the toxic bond completely die. You severed the family tie thinking it would terrify me into submission. But it actually set me entirely free. You said I was no longer your daughter, and you were right. I am not your daughter anymore. I am just a bank now, and the bank is evicting you. My mother let out another agonizing scream, collapsing completely flat against the floor. My father closed his eyes and let his head fall forward, accepting the absolute finality of his destruction. There were no more cards to play. There were no more flying monkeys they could send to manipulate me. I turned my back on the people who gave me life, and I walked out of the soundproof conference room. I did not look back. I left them sitting on the floor of my corporate office, surrounded by the shattered ruins of the lies they had spent 30 years building. 6 months have passed since that morning in the conference room. The dust has finally settled, and the reality of the legal system has taken its full course. Trent tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the federal prosecutors had overwhelming evidence against him thanks to the forensic file I provided. He pled guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and illegal gambling operations. He is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The 22-year-old mistress he was funding completely vanished the moment the offshore bank accounts were frozen. Dominique's life became a very public and very humiliating disaster. The FBI seized her phone and her computers for evidence. Her highly curated Instagram account went completely dark for a few days before the local news stations picked up the story of the massive fraud investigation. Her 60,000 followers turned on her, instantly tearing her apart in the comment sections. She is currently out on bail, waiting for her federal trial to begin next month. She is living on a friend's worn-out couch, working shifts at a fast food restaurant just to pay her public defender. The luxury influencer lifestyle she was so desperate to maintain is entirely dead and buried. As for my parents, the foreclosure process was swift and absolutely merciless. Vanguard Horizon Partners seized the sprawling brick estate in Buckhead. I made sure the eviction happened on a bright Saturday morning when all the wealthy neighbors were home to watch. The moving trucks arrived, and my parents had to carry their belongings out the front door while the entire gated community whispered and pointed. They lost their country club memberships because they could no longer afford the dues. They stopped attending their prestigious megachurch, entirely too deeply ashamed to show their faces to the pastor and the congregation after the massive scandal was exposed. They now rent a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of Atlanta, living on fixed Social Security incomes and drowning in medical debt from my mother's stress-induced panic attacks. I never spoke to them again. I changed my personal cell phone number and instructed the security desk at my office building to permanently ban them from the premises. The silence they left behind was the greatest gift I have ever received. I am 32 years old and I am finally thriving. My career at the private equity firm has skyrocketed, and I recently purchased a beautiful modern home overlooking the mountains outside the city. I spend my weekends hosting quiet dinners with my true chosen family. I surround myself with friends, colleagues, and mentors who celebrate my success instead of treating it like a personal ATM machine. There is no screaming, no emotional manipulation, and no religious guilt trips masquerading as love. In our community, there is a very toxic concept known as the black tax. It is the unspoken expectation that the one person who manages to escape the cycle of struggle and build real wealth must permanently sacrifice their peace to fund the bad decisions of everyone else sharing their bloodline. We are told that family is everything, and that loyalty means setting yourself on fire to keep your relatives warm. But I learned the hard way that blood does not automatically equal love, and shared genetics do not give anyone the right to destroy your life. The greatest revenge I could have ever taken against my toxic family was not sending them to prison or seizing their house. The greatest revenge was simply refusing to play the role they assigned to me. I stopped being the scapegoat, and I started being the architect of my own absolute freedom. Have you ever had to draw a permanent hard boundary to protect your peace and your financial future from a toxic family member? Have you ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you just so you could finally breathe? I would love to hear your stories of survival and independence in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content about breaking toxic cycles and reclaiming your personal power. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that walking away from abuse is not selfish. It is basic survival. Thank you for listening to my journey. Remember, your worth is not defined by the people who are too blind to see your value. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next story.